Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the INSA's COVID-19 supply chain panel discussion. I now like to introduce INSA President Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg.
Thank you and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the COVID-19 supply chain panel discussion. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers today, and we are especially pleased to have here with us today Jen Santos, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Policy. Jen, thanks for making the time to be here with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping notes with the group. As in past webcasts, at the top of your screen, you'll see an area for Q&A. I would encourage you all to ask questions, identify both your name and organization when you do, and the moderator will try to get to as many of those as they can. As a reminder, this session today is on the record, and we have several press virtually attending. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsor for today's program, Exiger, for their critical support of our virtual series. We could not deliver this type of expert insight without their support. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Jeff Scott, who is a Managing Director with Accenture Federal Service, where he is a client account lead in their defense agency sector. Jeff is also responsible for Accenture's management consulting operations practice, with over 31 years of supply chain management experience. Jeff, over to you.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So good afternoon, everybody. As Suzanne said, I'm Jeff Miller. I lead Accenture Federal's supply chain operations practice. I'll be this afternoon's panel moderator, and I'd like to welcome everybody, particularly our panel members, to this afternoon's discussion on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the global supply chain, and more importantly, insights we can apply in our roles as professionals supporting the intelligence and national security mission. We'll begin the session with some brief remarks from each panel member, followed by Q&A. In preparing for this afternoon's discussion, I reviewed some of Accenture's work in supply chain risk management and supply chain resiliency. And two things struck me reviewing the material. First, it's not a new problem. Much of the material I read was over 10 years old. As companies became more reliant on the global supply chain, they wanted to be better prepared for disruptions such as the Fukushima tsunami, the Iceland volcanic eruptions, and a common outcome was ensuring secondary and tertiary sources of supply that were not confined to the same geographic region. And none of what I read did they address the impact of a global pandemic on particular companies. Secondly, the approaches that were used to reduce and mitigate supply chain risk really haven't changed. They were fundamentally about gathering, analyzing, applying intelligence, developing, as my old XO and the Joseph Hughes used to say, pre-planned responses. This is something our community understands well. If there's a silver lining to this, it's that the data and analytic tools they're exponentially better right now than they were 10 years ago. We're better equipped to become more proactive in managing supply chain risk. Our challenge is getting equipped and establishing the policies and the organizational agility to respond to what is a solvable problem. So with that, I'd like to introduce each of our guests. Jennifer Santos is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Policy. She's the Undersecretary's principal advisor for analyzing the capabilities and overall health and policies concerning the industrial base. Mike Gordon serves as Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Lockheed Martin. He's responsible for the organization's overall information, security strategy, policy, security engineering operations, cyber threat detection, and response. Austin Evans oversees risk management in Intel's global supply chain organization. Some of his responsibilities include business continuity, supply chain security, Intel's contingent worker program, and all other aspects of supply chain risk. And then finally, Brandon Daniels. Brandon is president of Global Markets at Exiger. He leads assessment of the design, deployment, and operational management of financial crime compliance systems and technology, and oversees the firm's supply chain data analytics work for the Department of Defense. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to each of our guests to make some brief remarks regarding how the crisis is impacting their organizations. So Jen, starting with you, I'll turn it over to you to offer some of your thoughts, and then we'll move over to I'll introduce other panel members. So Jen, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jeff, and thank you for hosting this event. Hello, my name is Jennifer Santos, and again, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Industrial Policy. So what does that mean? Industrial Policy is the organization that provides some clarity on the supply chain vulnerabilities, also manage the Office of Small Business Policy. I have the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S., as well as Trusted Capital. So 4 kind of lines of effort inside of industrial policy. So within the past month and a half, we have recalibrated aspects of our mission to identify ways to partner with industry as we jointly navigate the challenges brought by COVID-19. We are doing this within 3 lines of effort: assess, protect, and promote. One of the first things Secretary Lord did in response to the changes brought about by COVID under assess was to direct me to host a regular touch point with industry. We now host teleconferences with over a dozen industry associations, including INSA, 3 times per week. That's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, with one of those sessions focused completely on small business, which is our Friday session. We also started hosting small business webinars in response to the small business request, working with the Small Business Administration. The first one was on cyber hygiene. The second one, which is tomorrow, is on adversarial capital and foreign direct investment. The following week, we're hosting one on cash flow, hosted by our defense pricing and contracting folks. And then the next week is telework. So our whole intent is to get out there with industry, understand the stresses and strains and the impacts to our industry partners. This understanding about facts on the ground has directly shaped the department's response to the coronavirus national emergency, resulting in meaningful relief for our defense industrial base members. There's a silver lining to this moment that has illuminated vulnerabilities in our supply chain that might not have otherwise come to light, including and perhaps especially those supply chains that are outside of our United States. We're learning more than ever. At the same time, this moment presents opportunity for our adversaries, and we must guard against those. So Undersecretary Lord warned about adversarial capital investment just a few weeks ago, and under our PROTECT mission, it's critically important that we understand that during this crisis, the defense industrial base is vulnerable to adversarial capital, so we need to ensure companies can stay in business without losing their technology or their intellectual property and their know-how. So to protect our industrial base, we have tools to combat this capital, like strengthening and expanding national security investment reviews under the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, referred to as CFIUS, and its expansion to FIRMA this past February. Those are more important than ever. We simply cannot afford to let this period of economic uncertainty lead to loss of American know-how on critical technologies. Our efforts with regard to CFIUS remain as vigilant as ever. As part of our promote of our mission, we have authorities that we can leverage to help our supply chain. These include the Defense Production Act, or DPA authorities. As you're probably aware, and I described in the beginning of this conversation, the Defense Production Act authorities lie under my organization as well. So you can imagine the busyness of my small government team. Further, over the past few weeks, we have been hosting Trusted Capital events. This program has continued to host these events virtually. This program has been launched to get to the left of CFIUS by ensuring critical companies are able to access clean capital that assists their commercialization. As you can see, even in these extraordinary times, our assess, protect, and promote lines of effort remain more important as ever as we work to address the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you. Over to you, Jeff. Jeff, are you still online?
Austin, I think you're up next if you want to introduce us to how you're
Okay.
typically addressing supply chain.
Yeah, I can do that. So Austin Evans from Intel Corporation. So supply chain risk management and business continuity has really been something that's been institutionalized in how we do business for many years. Because we have global operations, we have manufacturing facilities, not only in the US, but we have large sites in Ireland, Israel, Vietnam, Malaysia, and China. So with respect to COVID, because we have two manufacturing sites in China in very different locations, and they have very unique operations from each other. When COVID started to impact, residents in China and the Chinese economy, we were able to stand up our business continuity plan within Intel back in late January. And as we saw, the wave of infection spread across the world, first to Europe and then to the US, we, enacted those additional parts of our business continuity plan. We've got literally thousands of suppliers across the world, and I think we've been able to be successful because we've had, long-standing plans going back many, many years. It was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011. We have a large supply base in Japan, and we're able to take away a lot of learnings from that event, almost 10 years ago, and build those and institutionalize those into how we manage risk in our supply chain, and that's helped us out tremendously, in dealing with the current situation.
Great, thank you. This is Larry Hanauer from the INSA staff. I'm going to jump in since we seem to be having some technical problems with our moderator's connection. Let me move on to Mike from Lockheed. Just tell us a little bit about your role in your role as CISO, how you oversee some of Lockheed's supply chain challenges and how those have been affected by the crisis.
Yeah, sure, Larry. So one of the interesting roles, I think, in a lot of large corporations, the CISO tends to own the internet points of presence and remote access due to the high risk that they present. So a lot of my early work in the COVID crisis was working with our IT organization to kind of bolster our remote access capacity, which enables not only our employees but also our suppliers to access resources within our network. We also continue to try to work with our supply chain to kind of bolster their awareness on cybersecurity. With this COVID crisis, there's been a significant increase in malicious cyber attacks, particularly in the criminal arena, trying to harvest information, credentials, financial fraud, and steal data from not just our users but everyone. And so trying to keep our suppliers regularly aware of the cybersecurity risks. One of the things that we've done as a kind of a defense industry group, the large sets of prime contractors over the last year, is set up what we call a shared assist portal. It's a website connected to the National Defense ISAC, our information sharing group, which offers information and best practices on how to secure different infrastructures and different parts of your IT network to our supplier base. And we are working to encourage them to do as much as they can to continue to strengthen themselves.
Great, thank you. Jeff, you're back on. Do you want to take over? I can stay online in case we have more technical difficulties.
Yeah, I apologize, folks. Don't know what's happening here. So I guess that was through you just went through the first set of questions, Larry.
Right. So I think we want to turn to Brandon and just ask him a little bit about Exiger's work on data analytics and how data analytics kind of work to improve supply chain intelligence.
Perfect.
And then we can go through some other questions.
Okay, Brandon, over to you.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, COVID has impacted our organization. Inherently, we're a global business, right? We have hundreds of people across the globe working for clients and doing governance, risk, supply chain analysis work. And this has been a challenging time, right? We have had to harden our infrastructure to make sure we could support the kind of confidential matters that we work on. And we've had to really answer the call to work differently, right? To move from abstract interactions when you're teleworking to much more communal, engaged conversation. We've also had to, just like everyone else on the phone has been talking about, shore up our supply chain, shore up our own suppliers, make sure that we are helping them to manage their infrastructure, their cash flow, so that we can be good supply chain partners, right? But at the same time, we've had a unique insight because we've been helping across different initiatives to help customers shore up their supply chain, to better understand their supply chain. And we've been doing that, as Jeff mentioned, and Larry, you mentioned, through data analytics, right? So we've been using one of our platforms to essentially help clients respond to the COVID crisis, right? So first of all, there's a huge influx of PPE, medical device, and pharmaceutical purchases that institutions and government agencies are trying to do right now, right? And so what we've been trying to illuminate for them is where the bad apples are, where the opportunities are, and that's just as important at this phase of our supply chain sort of engagement as risk vetting, right? Looking for opportunities. And three, helping them to create a sustainable model. So not something that can only be used in COVID, but something that can be used as we look out into the rest of the defense industrial base, or in fact, the rest of the US industrial base. And so we've been helping our clients to essentially cope with the same challenges we're having on a microscopic level in comparison to them at a very extreme level, right? To the tune of billions of dollars, so of new spend in alternative supplier and change management, right? So it's been a stress on the organization, I think, just like every other organization, but it's also been something where we've had the privilege to work for folks that are really making a difference in the world, helping the U.S. To get critical medical devices and medical equipment to the healthcare professionals and to the administrators on the front line.
Great, thanks, Brandon. So I think, did everybody get to have their brief introduction? I think we can move over to some questions right now. Great. Yeah, so the first set of questions just are involving disruptions you're seeing in your supply chain as a result of the crisis, how we're responding. Jen, I mean, starting with you, you offered, I think, a lot of that in your introductory comments, but are there other things that you might want to comment there on what DoD is seeing right now in terms of this, larger impact of this on the defense supply chain?
Yes, so thanks, Jeff. So domestically, we are seeing the greatest impacts in aviation supply chain, shipbuilding, and small space launch. Those are kind of three critical sectors that are important, of course, for our defense industrial base. We're working closely with our industry partners in those areas, but those are areas where we see the greatest impact. In addition to data gathered from our industry calls that I mentioned in my opening statements, we're working really closely with the Defense Contract Management Agency. So they created a portal a few days after FEMA stood up, that companies provide their status, and that's not just companies that fall under DCMA. We overlay that with a heat map that we created for the Secretary of Defense with the CDC Johns Hopkins data that can kind of do predictive analytics on some of the industrial base areas where we have deficiencies, and we bring all that together in weekly discussions on Fridays where we host the Industrial Base Council, and we take that into effect and we assess which levers we can do to help those vulnerabilities in our industrial base. Over.
No, great. Thank you much. Great insight there. Austin, maybe a question over to you in terms of, if you look at how Intel has traditionally managed supply chain risk, and how this disruption is sort of impacting your company now. Maybe you can offer some, comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So supply chain risk and business continuity is really built into our DNA. Within our own factory network, we have a couple concepts that we speak about often, and one is virtual factory, and another concept is copy exact. And what that means is that we can fundamentally move and manufacture a product that's traditionally made at one location in the world and copy that exact process and replicate that at another factory. So within our own network, we have that flexibility. From a supply chain perspective, this is something that we prepare for and have been preparing for years and years. So we regularly conduct business continuity drills to test our own readiness. Over the past 2 years, we've actually been doing what I would describe as a deep dive audit of the internal business continuity plans within each of our key commodity areas to assess their readiness and availability to act. And so when an event like this occurs, we've already practiced it and we've tested the plan itself to see if it's ready for prime time. We also have an infrastructure in place that we've been using for a number of years, and all we had to do was stand it up and turn it on. We knew who needed to be in those meetings, and all we had to do was to schedule those meetings and start having the discussions. So for example, we have what we call a war room meeting, and we've been conducting this meeting daily since the end of January when the virus started in China. And so within that meeting, we've got all the key leaders and subject matter experts within the supply chain to discuss and deal with the challenges of the day, and then also do scenario planning and look out to see what challenges may be coming on the horizon. So for example, when the challenges presented themselves in China, we saw that the probability of this spreading across the world and getting in front of those challenges in other geographies, whether it was making sure those other suppliers were prepared, building additional days of inventory to head off any supply chain restrictions.
Great, thank you. Mike, maybe a question for you as a CISO. As the crisis has forced workers to work remotely, how's Lockheed dealing with the potential increase of cyber hacking that threaten the critical information that Lockheed needs to secure?
Yeah, so Jeff, let me start a little bit with just kind of on the general business side of the house. I think the early days of the COVID pandemic were, the most stressful for many folks in the defense industrial base, as we had to work through the definition of the essential workforce. The nature of our industry holistically is that a good percentage of people can telework, but the production lines, the classified work, those things generally happen inside of a facility. So working with DoD Mission Assurance and Department of Homeland Security in the onset of the COVID crisis to really clarify the nature of the essential nature of the DIB and the different types of activities that we support, as each state was rolling out their travel restrictions kind of uniquely, was a complex challenge that really great work on the defense industrial based teams through the corporations that were involved, the industry associations, and the government to really keep the industry working. And in that regard, at Lockheed Martin, we've seen fairly minor delays of some of the products that we need coming into our corporation from our suppliers, but nothing has significantly disrupted or shut down any of our internal production operations. From a cybersecurity perspective, I think the interesting thing here is the volume of attack space that we see growing. And we know that it's coming after our employees and across the suppliers and just everyone around the world, and sharing more and more cyber intelligence through the information sharing regimes that we have with DHS, with the ISACs, and with our suppliers. I think is going to be a critical part of them not getting breached during these times. And just by way of some metrics, I mean, we're seeing well over 2,000 emails a day that we're blocking either through commercial or custom technologies that are COVID themed phishing attacks. So it's just a massive amount of opportunistic threats coming against that. And it's also an interesting theme to look at how much email is COVID related that's coming and going from the corporation, just in general. 50 plus thousand, emails a day or have some kind of COVID theme to them. Most of which are valid and business related, and a lot of those are with our suppliers and making sure that they can continue to do work.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, moving over to a second set of questions on how the crisis has highlighted some of the risks of the global supply chain. Jen, maybe starting with you, how has this sort of illuminated the U.S.'s dependency on foreign countries, and some of which obviously are adversarial, in providing critical supplies and equipment, and maybe talk a little bit about how the department is looking to mitigate these risks in the future.
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, the Department of Defense relies on a global supply chain. We're integrated with our allies and partners. It's the second line of the National Defense Strategy. But we are seeing impacts on our industrial base in several pockets of closures internationally. Particularly of note in recent is Mexico, where we have a group of companies that are impacting many of our major primes. And so what are we doing about it? Our best asset is our communication. And so my boss, Secretary Lord, has been liaisoning directly with the Mexican leadership to identify those companies and identify and express the essentiality and the importance of those companies supporting technologies like our airframe production. And my colleagues in DCMA are working within international cooperation, which are two other lines of business inside of Secretary Lord's that are issuing and tracking these issues and working to mitigate them on a daily basis. But every day we get notified of a global supply chain company or domestic that is having a vulnerability. But we take each one of those very seriously. We want to protect the workforce most importantly, and ensure, just like Mike expressed, the essentiality part of this. Over.
No, great. Thanks, Jen. Brandon, maybe over to you, and just, understanding, I think a lot of this was illuminated, foreign ownership. For one, I never knew that pharmaceuticals, were being made in China. And so maybe talk a little bit about, how the acquisition community can better understand this, understanding foreign financing, left as far as possible of the actual acquisition. Maybe talk a little bit about some of what you're seeing and some ideas about how to improve that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen two things during the crisis. The first is obviously pronounced because of our medical sector review, right? So we've had to do an incredible amount of work to illuminate what was not previously considered to be a part of our core defense assets, which is the medical industry, right? And we've had to understand it at a much deeper level. And one of the things that we've noticed that has been incredibly impactful is just how much of the manufacturing, just how much of the resource management, the core raw material resource management has been outsourced out of America's hands, right? And in some cases, with some products, PPE, medical devices, some of the medical equipment we need, there is a feeling that the constraints are inherently there because these foreign governments are going to operate and execute with those materials in their jurisdictions first, right? And so we've seen the fact that a huge volume of the medical sector has moved outside of the United States from a manufacturing perspective, from a finishing perspective, from a distribution perspective. A huge number of the major suppliers, whether we're talking about thermometers, or underlying ventilator components have essentially been moved to Asia or other lower cost jurisdictions. And two impacts are essentially felt. One is the potential weaponization of the supply chain, right? So we started 50, 100 years ago with really weapons and intel being the major forms of warfare. Economic sanctions, export control management became another way in which you could gain ground and manage both your adversaries and your allies. You saw cyber in the early 2000s really become a major platform for attacks. And now it kind of feels like we're landlocked. In certain instances, the ability to control, the ability to manage, the ability to draw from our supply chain is at the, in some cases, at the behest of our adversaries. And so that was one primary sort of pronounced component of the crisis. The second one was just the quality, right? So we'd go out to procure goods, we'd go out to a US distributor, and we'd look at the underlying supply chain that they would rely on, and we'd see that the manufacturing standards that are required in the context of medical devices or PPE like an N95 respirator were just not what were required in order to keep our healthcare professionals safe. And so there's a piece of this where adversarial finance, where adversarial capital really creates a threat to not only our industrial health, but our national security. And that was one thing that just came directly to light in the first few weeks of working on COVID response efforts. The second thing that I've seen is as the COVID economic conditions have essentially put a vice on a lot of companies from a survival perspective, what you also see is that our adversaries and really, not just our adversaries, but also countervailing economic interests are making hay, right? It could be in consolidating in the consolidation in the semiconductor space, which we're seeing, right? Or it could be, furtherance of satellite priorities or whatever it might be. We're seeing major actors recognize the importance of managing and controlling their supply chain, their systems, and making use of the fact that they might be capital rich and some of the technologies that are critical to the defense industrial base or just to our sort of global security are at risk. And so what we've done in response to this is try to shine a light on it in the analysis and the data analytics that we've been doing to try to really dig a lot deeper into not only adversarial capital, but situations in which supply chain bottlenecks right now are not sources of adversarial capital, but their industry have been subject to significant volumes of M&A activity, right? So looking at, as Jen mentioned, vulnerability in the context of criticality of the technology. That's one thing we've been doing in the data analytics space. The other thing that we've been doing, which is fabulous, is trying to support those innovative consortiums that are trying to bring together U.S. manufacturing and critical medical supplies. I think in no other sector could it be more pronounced that a supply chain could be weaponized like our medical sector. It is literally the lifeblood of the United States. And so making sure that we're promoting and creating those opportunities for US-based manufacturing, not to be isolationists and not to essentially say that we're the only place in which we can have productive capacity, but to make it so that we're not completely dependent on foreign capacity for goods and services has been another critical part of what we've been doing, sort of illuminating the alternatives and supporting consortiums that have the operational capability to compete with today's productive capacity. And I think between, finding the adversarial risk and the vulnerabilities, and then also identifying opportunities, which the government and the Department of Defense has been, extremely bullish on finding and promoting the industry evolution to support critical areas of supply.
Great. No, thanks, Brandon. And so, and around that, so maybe Austin, a question for you. As you have looked at kind of around this area of data and analytics and information, can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the tools that Intel uses to address this type of risk? Are these capabilities you develop in-house? What outside sources of information and intelligence are you using to help secure your supply chain?
Yeah, great question. So it's really a combination of both in-house tools as well as we do use a third-party tool. And where we use that specifically is we load the names and the geographic locations of our most critical suppliers into the tool. And so anytime there's a disruption, whether it's a geopolitical event or a natural disaster, we get a proactive notification, via the tool to say, this event is going on in this location, and here's a list of all of your critical suppliers that are within the region. And what it allows us to do is act very quickly. The other piece that has been illuminated based on, past events and experiences and has really come into play in managing through the COVID situation is the ability to have quick and easy access and visibility to your supply base, so that at any point in time you can see these are the suppliers that we're depending on to produce this good or service, and this is where they're located. These are the suppliers where we may be single or sole sourced, and as a result, the risk profile is going to be higher there. As we forecast out, if there were to be an impact to them for whatever reason, what is our backup or mitigation strategy to go through that? That way we're able to do some proactive planning and get in front of the situation and avoid scenarios where we're on our heels and having to react with not a lot of time.
No, good. Thanks, Austin. And Jen, maybe a question over to you around this. So how is the department starting to sort of rethink the tools in which it's using? Because if you look at this type of analysis, in the early stages of an acquisition, probably, most contracting officers aren't there looking at, secondary, sources of financial ownership and things like that. These are things that are sort of just getting illuminated now. So maybe provide some insight, like where the department maybe is going with this, what tool sets they might want to use, but from a process change, are there things that are going to be done maybe differently in that area moving forward?
Thanks, Jeff, for the question. Well, I would say we are using a lot of tools, right? There's data analytics tools. We're similar vein. We have in-house created tools. We use commercial tools. But the way I describe it is being able to diagnose the health of the industrial base, right? So in our 13806 report, Executive Order 13806 report, which was published about a year and a half ago, we did a really good diagnosis of the fragility, sole source, single source, foreign dependent companies in our industrial base. And so with that knowledge of our industrial base, we created this new tool, which is what I described a little bit as the Industrial Base Council, which we stood up last December was our first meeting. But the intent of that is the IBC, as I call it, addresses the gaps and the risks in the defense industrial base, prioritizes and aligns the DIB efforts to the DoD strategic priorities, leveraging all the authorities the DoD can use to mitigate those risks. And then lastly, develop policies to address those industrial-based vulnerabilities. And so in response to COVID and the impacts to the industrial base, the IBC acts on the information received from the defense industrial base stakeholders. We prioritize those risks around the 13806 report. We leverage another organization that we refer to as the Joint Industrial Base Working Group and their sector working groups and integrated product teams. And so there's a holistic look at this, right? So we assess the risk to the industrial base and we identify the levers. So right now, one of the levers that we've been using is the Defense Production Act. In the CARES Act, we received $1 billion in the Title III Defense Production Act. And so we've been using that. One, funding is a lever. Two, helping companies get small business loans under the Paycheck Protection Program. We've been working really closely with the Small Business Administration, as that is one lever that is a phenomenal lever. And of course, they expanded that to add an additional $310 billion. And that went live on Monday. And of course, there's other levers in the CARES Act to help our industrial base too, either from the loans, the SBA loans, Paycheck Protection Program, or in Section 4003, which is the Treasury and National Security $17 billion loan program that was stood up and went live yesterday, as well as the small business innovative research work we do with small businesses and adding capacity and growing the industrial base. Those are all tools that help us understand, and then those are some of the levers we're using to mitigate some of those. Hopefully that's helpful. Over.
No, very, very helpful. Thank you. Just let me pivot quickly. I'm gonna have one. I think we're gonna be able to get through one kind of moderate or questions that we kind of came up with, and we can start getting into some of the ones the audience is asking here. But Mike, over to you from a perspective of you're obviously, as you're transacting with this universe of suppliers out there at Lockheed, and all the bits and bytes going back and forth, from a cybersecurity perspective, what are some things that maybe some insight you can provide and how that should be, how you're protecting that, where in as much as the information flow back and forth that ultimately is impacting your supply chain. Maybe talk a little bit about some of those from a transactional type of perspective, things that you're doing to protect that information.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is an area where COVID hasn't changed the paradigm for me all that much, in that the cybersecurity posture of our supply chain is something that is a considerable concern and always top of mind and top of the priority list for myself within Lockheed Martin and for my peers across the industry. And I think what the situation does is it causes us to try to speed up some of the efforts that we have been doing. The first is sharing information with the suppliers just on cyber risks and threats, as I mentioned before. The second ties into continuing our support towards the DoD's initiatives for the cyber maturity model certification, CMMC, and ensuring that those processes are going to continue to be understood by our supply chain and that they can continue to develop their preparedness for the eventual audit and certification, which seems to be staying relatively on schedule from a DoD implementation perspective. And then third, we've teamed up with several intelligence community partners, DoD entities, and other large suppliers to try to develop technical capabilities that we can share with our suppliers who generally don't have the means, financially or the subject matter expertise to implement advanced technical security controls. Like, how do they better secure DNS? How can they better secure and identify malicious emails coming into their environment? How can we evolve the use of digital rights management to protect information as it flows from a prime to a sub or further below into our supply chain? So if anything, I would think that the COVID activities have just highlighted the need to expedite the things that we've been working on to help shore up the cybersecurity posture of the industry.
No, great. Appreciate that insight. So I think with that, we're going to go over some of the questions that we're getting from our audience members. And first one is a good one. And Jen, I'm going to start with you and then ask other panel members to maybe provide some of their opinions as much as they're willing to do so with this. But the question is, how has the COVID-19 crisis changed the way the Department of Defense thinks about foreign attempts to acquire U.S. companies? I wonder if you might have some insight on that one.
Well, I mean, we have the CFIUS process, right, that's been established, and FIRMA went into effect in February to expand the jurisdiction of critical technology and locations, real estate. But I will tell you that we take that role and responsibility of identifying the national security risk associated with this transaction on every single foreign direct investment. And I brought on a new teammate. He started earlier this year. His name's Andrew Pahutsky, running the CFIUS portfolio, and we're working really closely with our international partners and allies, and so we have really close relationships with other countries. We work together to make sure we understand the risks associated with the transactions, and if we do find a risk, we mitigate or we block the transaction. We need to protect our industrial base from what could be adversarial capital, and during COVID, we maintain the same due diligence with or without COVID. And so it's been an important mission that we've been managing, and I'll tell you, it's what keeps me up at night most of the nights, more of the foreign direct investment in areas of vulnerabilities than any other part of my portfolio. Over.
Great, thanks, Jen. And Brandon, maybe you can offer a comment on that one. That the challenge here is obviously it's like you don't know what you don't know with a lot of these. So understanding sort of like where this investment is coming from and how challenging it is to get that information. Maybe you can talk in terms of at Exiger, things that you do to make sure you're able to track this stuff down, to the nth order.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think the first thing is that doing this analysis, whether it's adversarial capital, or it's a diagnostic on the health of a sector, right? As Jen had mentioned, one of the things that often happens is that's left to after acquisition, right? Acquisition focuses on an eval, on a contracting model, on compliance, right? On the FAR, and what we're seeing is that then the adversarial finance issues, adversarial capital issues end up as a CI issue, right? The CI problem. And what we're seeing is that it's important to drag this analysis. In COVID, it's been, the assessment and diagnostic of adversarial finance and of health of a sector. But it's also the bona fides of a company, right? So am I buying $50 million of something from someone that's only ever, sold 100,000 of something? And do they have a plan for actually delivering to me, right? And so the context of supply chain risk management and, foreign ownership, control, and influence, right? Those dynamics from the ability to perform on a contract, right, are critical to that acquisition, right? To the acquisition happening and not having to be replaced in a year, to that acquisition being effective, calling out those issues earlier than ever before, I think is important. And usually you would expect legislative change, you'd expect a direct policy change to drive that kind of awareness, but because of the team at DoD really, and then I think the defense community writ large, I think people are aware of the fact that adversarial capital and moving an assessment of the sector to the left of acquisition is important. So my first point is really the timing, right? We've been doing it way on the right. We've got to move it to the left. The second point that I have is how deep you have to go. And our traditional model is to look at the owners, to look at the KMPs, to look at the primary ownership structure, maybe dig one layer deeper than that. If that, in most acquisition, processes, if you're not getting access to classified content, you're not going through that depth of analysis. And so what we're seeing is that people are having to acquire data in large sums, right? Both the information published by the company, the information published in data sources like corporate registries, but then also digging into unstructured content like publications that the entities have made, press releases that are out in foreign countries and are only available on Baidu as an example, right? So digging into that unstructured content and trying to find where you might have, let's say, a Cayman entity that's really an adversary's finance vehicle, right? Mm-hmm. And this happens, and it happens more often than you'd think. And particularly in the COVID crisis, we've seen it occur, and we've seen it occur alongside of fraud and what we feel like is criminal activity. So it's not completely, it's not just adversarial finance and adversarial capital. It's also connected with, potentially the intention to do harm. And so I think that we're seeing a huge shift to moving to big data analytics to manage this problem and to help with this problem, because that's the only way to effectively do some of these deeper, more complex ownership reviews.
Great. Okay, thanks, Brandon. Got time for a couple more questions here. Jen, one over to you. Do you anticipate utilizing the Defense Production Act to restore any critical domestic manufacturing capabilities? Has that come up, or maybe you can offer some insight there?
Yeah, Defense Production Act has 3 titles: Title I, Title III, and Title VII. The one you're referring to is Title III, which is increase in long-term pricing agreements, reinvigorating or fixing companies from financial distress due to COVID. It's been a phenomenal tool. Last year we had 14 presidential determinations signed out of DPA Title III. We've been using this since the 1950 when it was created to increase capacity where we might have a single or fragile supplier. And so yes, the Defense Production Act, of course, is one of the levers we're using to restore capital in industries where we have vulnerabilities that we can't live with, right? And so if it's a fragile supplier and it's the only supplier in one of our multiple weapon systems, we cannot let them go financially distressed. And so we will use whatever levers necessary. In the Defense Production Act and the CARES Act, under DPA Title III, we received $1 billion. And so we're investing that in areas where we have those most biggest vulnerabilities, like I said at the beginning, in aviation and shipbuilding, and small launch, in areas where in some areas there's dual use, right? Dual technology, whether it's commercial companies with a small percentage of defense work and their commercial work has gone under. And so we cannot let their defense work go under. So we team with them. But there's, of that $1 billion, it's probably marked for a whole lot more money than just $1 billion of requirements. But we're using the IBC, teamed with all the service acquisition and sustainment leads and the joint staff to prioritize where the most important investments need to be made to protect the industrial base. We also have been working very, very diligently and closely with Health and Human Services and FEMA. And one of the recent awards we had under the Defense Production Act Title III was on the N95, expanding the industrial capacity for 3 manufacturers. And so we've awarded that about 2 weeks ago-ish. And so we'll continue to identify those areas and work together. As an example, I sent, shortly after FEMA was stood up, I sent my deputy, Scott Baum, over to sit over in FEMA to understand how we can work together and use those authorities that are phenomenal opportunities. Over.
No, thanks, Jen. And I think a lot of questions on this whole thing of lessons learned with the shortfalls in medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Are there any other, is there any other comments on those specific lessons learned? Where moving forward in terms of HHS obviously managing the strategic stockpile in these areas versus other DoD entities like DLA, and curious as to what your thoughts are on lessons learned and what we might be doing differently in the future in some of those critical areas.
Well, I would say in a lessons learned perspective, right, there's a lot to learn from this unfortunate, horrible pandemic that we're in right now. People use the word illumination. I use it illumination plus health, understanding our supply chain and having better insights into it. I would say when it comes to our teamwork with HHS, in the executive order directing the Department of HHS to lead on the medical and health resources, understanding the supply chain in those areas when it comes to N95 masks and ventilators and pharmaceuticals, test kits, suppliers, reagents, knowing those vulnerabilities. I would say the one thing that, for me, if you're asking Jen Santos, my perspective, I think the one thing that I've learned through this COVID experience is how to listen better and understanding how to really put yourself in the shoes of these industrial-based partners and be able to look through their lens and find out ways to protect them. And, hosting, so I've hosted 20 of those industrial association calls, and some of the things I've learned from manufacturing facilities, factories, our agricultural industry and how that affects our national security, to our commissaries. I mean, there's just, we have a real global reliance, and at the same time, when companies decide no longer to share their equipment or technology, or they can't because they're in their own lockdown themselves, we have to have second sources and abilities to help each other out. So I would say the biggest lesson learned for me has been in the listening and really putting ourselves in our industrial partners' shoes. Without their help, we would not be where we are. So over.
Great, thanks, Jen. So first of all, thanks to all of our the panelists here. I think there's a couple of other questions. A lot of this we've covered, but I think we just don't have time right now. So I'd like to thank everybody, and Suzanne, turn it back over to you for any closing comments. Thank you.
Great. I would like to echo that. I'd like to thank Jen, Mike, Austin, and Brandon all for joining us this afternoon, and Jeff, your assistance in moderating this very timely discussion. For all of you watching us online, thanks for joining us. I want to thank Exiger for supporting this event as we have pivoted to virtual events. It's really key that our corporate members stand up behind us and really appreciate your support. A couple things. I'll be moderating a conversation with Sue Calloway, Director of Analysis at NGA, tomorrow about the same time. Sue's going to talk to us a little bit about humility and leadership. Then on May 5th, Coffee and Conversation with Kevin Miners, our chair, Tish Long, will be moderating that discussion. And then May 6th with Sue Gordon as well. And for all of you supply chain security junkies, we're also hosting another supply chain panel on May 19th, and then another one in July. So you can find out the lineup for all of these virtual events on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see many of you all from my closet tomorrow afternoon with Stu Calloway. Have a good afternoon.